The funny thing about first love is it never really leaves you. Not in a painful way, not in a way that keeps you awake at night. It just stays somewhere quiet. Sometimes, when the world slows down, like it does on nights like this, it drifts back to the surface. I was sitting here by the fire earlier, listening to it crackle, and I found myself thinking about the first person who ever made my heart feel different. Not because it ended badly, but because it ended the way a lot of things do, by changing. Tonight, I thought I'd tell you that story. Back then, I didn't have a word for what I was feeling. I don't think I even tried to name it. It just felt like something gentle settling in, the way you notice a season changing without paying attention to the exact day it happens. Nothing announced itself. Nothing demanded attention. It was simply there, growing quietly in the background. We crossed paths the same way you cross paths with a lot of people in life, through routine, the kind of routine you don't think twice about. Same place, same time, over and over again, until familiarity replaces formality. At first, they were just someone I recognized, someone I nodded to, someone whose presence felt normal enough that I didn't question it. Conversations came easily, but not in a way that stood out right away. There was no spark I could point to, no moment I replayed in my head afterward. We talked about ordinary things, work, plans, small frustrations, things that didn't matter much on their own, and yet somehow those conversations lingered longer than the rest. I'd catch myself thinking about something they said hours later, not because it was profound, but because it felt honest. I didn't rush toward it. I didn't feel the need to. There was comfort in not knowing what it was yet, in letting it exist without expectations. Being around them felt easy in a way that didn't ask anything of me. I didn't feel like I had to impress them or explain myself. I could show up exactly as I was, unfinished thoughts and all, and that seemed to be enough. What I remember most from that time isn't excitement. It's calm, the kind of calm that makes you linger a little longer than planned, that turns quick conversations into long ones without either person noticing how much time has passed. Silence didn't feel awkward. It felt shared. We could sit together without feeling every moment, and somehow that made the moments we did feel more meaningful. There were small signs looking back that something was taking shape, the way I noticed when they weren't around, the way my attention shifted when they entered a room, the way certain days felt lighter for no obvious reason. But at the time, I didn't examine any of it too closely. I was content letting it unfold at its own pace, trusting the feeling without needing to understand it. It wasn't love yet, or maybe it was, just not the kind I recognized. It hadn't been tested or named or defined. It was still soft around the edges, still finding its place. And in that space, before expectations, before promises, before the future started asking questions, it felt pure in a way that's hard to recreate later in life. I didn't know then that this was the beginning of something I'd carry with me for years. I just knew that being near them felt right, in a quiet, unremarkable way. And sometimes that's how the most important things begin, not with certainty, but with a feeling you're not ready to explain yet. I don't remember the exact day it changed, and I think that's part of why it stayed with me. There wasn't a moment you could circle on a calendar or point to later and say, that's when it happened. It was quieter than that, more subtle. The kind of shift you only recognize once you're already standing on the other side of it. We were doing something ordinary, something I've long since forgotten the details of. It might have been a conversation that went on longer than it should have, or a walk that didn't have a clear destination. What I do remember is the feeling that crept in somewhere along the way, the sense that I was more aware of them than I had been before, that their presence was no longer just familiar, but meaningful. At some point, I realized I was listening differently, not just waiting for my turn to speak, not half distracted by whatever else was going on in my life, but genuinely paying attention. The way they chose their words, the pauses between sentences, the expressions that crossed their face when they thought no one was watching. It felt like something had slowed down, like the rest of the world had stepped back just enough to give us space. There was a moment of eye contact that lasted a second longer than necessary. Not dramatic, not intense, just long enough to notice, long enough to feel a quiet awareness pass between us. Nothing was said about it, nothing needed to be. But I walked away afterward with the unmistakable sense that something had shifted, even if I couldn't yet explain what it was. From that point on, everything felt slightly different. Conversations carried more weight. Small gestures stood out more than they used to. I found myself replaying moments in my head later, not because I was trying to analyze them, but because they had settled somewhere deeper than expected. Being around them no longer felt simply comfortable. It felt intentional, as though my attention had chosen a direction without asking for permission. What struck me most was how natural it all felt. There was no rush, no surge of excitement demanding action. Just a quiet recognition, the kind that doesn't need confirmation right away. I didn't feel the need to tell anyone about it. I didn't even feel the need to tell myself. I just carried it, letting it sit where it was, trusting that whatever it was becoming didn't need to be named yet. Looking back now, I realize that was the moment the story truly began. Not when feelings became obvious, but when they became undeniable. When something ordinary turned meaningful without warning, and a person I had known casually began to matter in a way that felt both surprising and completely inevitable. After that, we didn't suddenly change the way we moved through the world. There were no declarations, no shift in how we introduced ourselves to each other. If anything, things stayed mostly the same on the surface, but underneath, something was settling into place, quietly and steadily, the way trust does when it's given room to grow. We spent more time together without ever really deciding to. One conversation would drift into another. Plans that were meant to be short would stretch into the evening. There was no urgency to any of it, no sense that we were chasing something or trying to get somewhere. Being together felt less like an event and more like a rhythm, something that fit naturally into the days as they unfolded. What I remember most is how easy it felt to talk. Not a kind of talking where you're trying to impress someone or steer the conversation in a certain direction, but the kind where thoughts came out unfinished and somehow still understood. We shared stories without embellishing them, opinions without defending them, and silences without needing to apologize for them. Over time, those silences became just as familiar as the conversations themselves. There was a comfort in being seen without feeling examined. I didn't feel like I had to present a version of myself that was more interesting or more certain than I actually was. Around them, I could admit when I didn't know what I wanted yet, when I was unsure or still figuring things out. Instead of creating distance, that honesty seemed to pull us closer, as though uncertainty was something we could hold together. Small moments began to carry more meaning than I expected, sitting side by side without speaking, laughing at something that wasn't particularly funny to anyone else, remembering details about each other that hadn't been asked for, just offered along the way. It wasn't the kind of closeness that announced itself loudly. It was the kind that built quietly, layer by layer, until it felt solid without ever feeling heavy. There was no pressure to define what we were doing or where it was heading. In that space, without labels or expectations, affection had room to breathe. Care grew without being rushed, and attachment formed without either of us having to acknowledge it out loud. It felt safe to let things unfold at their own pace, to trust that whatever this was didn't need to be hurried to be real. Looking back, that time stands out as one of the gentlest chapters of my life, not because it was perfect, but because it was unguarded. We weren't trying to hold on to anything yet. We were simply showing up day after day, letting closeness become familiar before we ever thought to question what it might cost us later. For a while, it was easy to believe that what we had could exist just as it was, untouched by anything outside of it. Days blended together comfortably, and the future stayed somewhere far enough away that it didn't ask much of us. But time has a way of making itself known, even when you're not looking for it. It started as a thought I'd have now and then, usually when things were quiet, a passing awareness that life wasn't standing still, even if we were content pretending it was. Responsibilities were beginning to take shape. Plans were forming, sometimes spoken aloud, sometimes kept private. There was no sense of alarm in it, just a gentle reminder that everything moves forward, whether you're ready for it or not. We didn't talk about it much at first, not because we were avoiding it, but because it didn't feel urgent yet. There was still plenty of space between the present and whatever came next. Still enough time to enjoy where we were without feeling like we needed to prepare for what might change. So we stayed there in that in-between place, letting the days pass without asking them too many questions. But awareness has a way of growing once it's been noticed. I began to see the small signs of it in moments that used to feel simple. Conversations would drift toward the future and then quietly turn back again. Plans would be made with an unspoken understanding that they might not last forever. There was nothing heavy about it, nothing that demanded action, just a soft undercurrent reminding us that this chapter wasn't meant to stay open indefinitely. What surprised me most was how calm it all felt. There was no panic, no sense that something was slipping away. Just an understanding, slowly settling in, that this closeness existed within a larger story, one that included paths we hadn't yet walked and choices we hadn't yet made. It wasn't fear that came with that realization. it was clarity. In some ways, that awareness deepened what we shared. Time together felt more intentional, more present. We listened a little more closely, stayed a little longer, held on to moments without trying to capture them. There was a quiet appreciation in knowing that what we had was happening now, in this season, exactly as it was meant to. Looking back, that was the moment when love stopped feeling timeless and started feeling precious. Not fragile, just finite. And instead of diminishing it, that knowledge gave it weight. It taught me that some connections aren't meant to last forever, to matter deeply. Some are meant to arrive, shape you gently, and move on, leaving you changed in ways you only understand much later. There was no single moment where we sat down and decided that things were over. No heavy conversation, no raised voices, no final words meant to close a door. If anything, it ended the way many things do in life, quietly, without asking for permission. At first, nothing seemed different. We still talked, still saw each other, still shared pieces of our days the way we always had. But somewhere beneath that familiarity, the shape of things had begun to change. Time stretched in new directions. Gaps appeared where closeness used to be effortless. And little by little, what had once felt constant began to feel conditional. I remember noticing it in the smallest ways. Conversations that didn't last as long as they used to. Plans that stayed tentative instead of settling into certainty. The feeling that moments mattered more because there were fewer of them. None of it felt intentional. No one was pulling away on purpose. Life was simply doing what it does, moving forward, carrying us along at its own pace. When we did spend time together, there was an unspoken awareness between us, a kind of softness, as though we both sensed that something was shifting but didn't quite know how to talk about it. We were careful with each other in a way that felt tender rather than distant, holding on to what remained without trying to force it into something it could no longer be. The last time we saw each other, I didn't know it would be the last. There was nothing remarkable about it. No final embrace meant to be remembered. Just an ordinary moment that passed the way all the others had, quietly, without ceremony. It was only later, looking back, that I realized how much weight that simplicity carried. There was no clean ending to mark the change, just fewer calls, longer pauses, and the gradual understanding that we were no longer moving through the same chapter of our lives. What we had didn't disappear all at once. It faded gently, the way daylight does at the end of a long day, leaving behind a warmth that lingered even after the light was gone. And somehow, that made it easier to accept. There was no anger to hold on to, no unfinished argument demanding resolution. Just the knowledge that what we shared had been real and that its ending wasn't a failure. It was a consequence of time doing what it has always done. Life didn't pause to acknowledge the change, and in some ways, I was grateful for that. Days kept unfolding the way they always had, one after another, carrying new responsibilities, new routines, and new people into view. There wasn't a sharp break between what had been and what came next, just a gradual shifting of focus as attention moved forward and the present asked to be lived in. At first, there were moments when memories surfaced unexpectedly, something familiar in a place we used to sit, a phrase that reminded me of an old conversation, a quiet evening that felt similar to ones we had shared. But those moments didn't hurt the way I might have expected them to. They arrived softly, stayed for a while, and then passed on, leaving behind a sense of recognition rather than loss. New chapters began without ceremony. Work became more demanding. Friendships changed shape. I met new people and learned new versions of myself in the process. What surprised me was how much of that first love traveled with me, not as a weight, but as a reference point. It had shown me what closeness could feel like when it wasn't rushed or complicated, and that understanding quietly informed the way I moved through relationships afterward. I didn't compare new connections to the old one, and I didn't feel the need to replace anything. What we had shared occupied its own space, complete and intact, without interfering with what came next. There was room for it to exist alongside growth, without pulling me backward or holding me still. Over time, the memory of that chapter settled into something steady. It became less about the person and more about the season of life it represented, a time of openness, patience, and quiet discovery. Remembering it felt like revisiting a familiar place rather than reopening an old wound. Looking back now, I see how necessary that experience was, not because it lasted, but because it taught me how to recognize care when it arrived and how to let it go when it was time. Life moved forward the way it always does, carrying lessons along with it, shaping what came next without needing to announce itself. Sitting here now, watching the fire burn low, it's strange how gently those memories return. Not with urgency, not with regret, but with a kind of calm familiarity. Time has softened the edges, leaving behind only what mattered. The feeling of having cared deeply and having been changed by it in ways that didn't need to be dramatic to be meaningful. I don't think first love stays with us because of how it ends. It stays because of how it begins. Before expectations settle in, before life asks you to choose between paths, before you understand how temporary even the most important moments can be. It reminds you of a version of yourself that was open, patient, and willing to let something grow without needing to control it. Looking back, I don't wish that things had turned out differently. What we shared belonged exactly where it was, in that moment of life when both of us were still becoming who we were meant to be. It didn't need to last forever, to leave its mark. It only needed to exist long enough to show me what love could feel like when it was given room to breathe. There's a quiet gratitude that comes with that understanding. Gratitude for the timing, imperfect as it was. Gratitude for the lessons that arrived gently instead of through loss. And gratitude for the way memory allows us to revisit certain chapters without being pulled back into them. As the fire settles and the night grows still, I'm reminded that not every story is meant to be carried forward unchanged. Some are meant to warm you for a while and then remain behind you, steady and intact as you move on. They become part of who you are without asking anything more from you. And maybe that's what first love really is. Not something you hold on to, but something you're grateful to have known. A quiet beginning that teaches you how to recognize care, patience, and connection when they appear again later in life. For now, that memory can rest where it belongs. The fire will keep burning. The night will stay calm, and tomorrow will come in its own time.